Introduction to Wage, Labour and Capital. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Karl Manchester, 2007. Introduction to Karl Marx's Wage, Labour and Capital by Friedrich Engels. This pamphlet first appeared in the form of a series of leading articles in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, beginning on April 4, 1849. The text is made up from lectures delivered by Marx before the German Workingmen's Club of Brussels in 1847. The series was never completed. The promise, quote, to be continued, end quote, at the end of the editorial in number 269 of the newspaper, remained unfilled in consequence of the precipitous events of that time, the invasion of Hungary by the Russians, and the uprisings in Dresden, Iserlohn, Elberfeld, the Palatinate, and in Baden, which led to the suppression of the paper on May 19, 1849. And among the papers left by Marx, no manuscript of any continuation of these articles has been found. Wage, Labour and Capital has appeared as an independent publication in several editions, the last of which was issued by the Swiss Cooperative Printing Association in Hottingen, Zurich, in 1884. Hitherto, the several editions have contained the exact wording of the original articles, but since at least 10,000 copies of the present edition are to be circulated as a propaganda tract, the question necessarily forced itself upon me, would Marx himself, under these circumstances, have approved of an unaltered literal reproduction of the original? Marx, in the 40s, had not yet completed his criticism of political economy. This was not done until toward the end of the 50s. Consequently, such of his writings as were published before the first instalment of his critique of political economy was finished deviate in some points from those written after 1859, and contain expressions and whole sentences which, viewed from the standpoint of his later writings, appear inexact and even incorrect. Now, it goes without saying that in ordinary editions, intended for the public in general, this earlier standpoint as a part of the intellectual development of the author has its place, that the author as well as the public has an indisputable right to an unaltered reprint of those older writings. In such a case, I would not have dreamt of changing a single word in it, but it is otherwise when the edition is destined almost exclusively for the purpose of propaganda. In such a case, Marx himself would unquestionably have brought the old work, dating from 1849, into harmony with his new point of view, and I feel sure that I am acting in his spirit when I insert in this edition the few changes and additions which are necessary in order to attain the object in all essential points. Therefore, I say to the reader at once, the pamphlet is not as Marx wrote it in 1849, but approximately as Marx would have written it in 1891. Moreover, so many copies of the original text are in circulation that these will suffice until I can publish it again unaltered in a complete edition of Marx's works, to appear at some future time. My alterations centre about one point. According to the original reading, the worker sells his labour for wages, which he receives from the capitalist. According to the present text, he sells his labour power. And for this change, I must render an explanation to the workers, in order that they may understand that we are not quibbling or word juggling, but are dealing here with one of the most important points in the whole range of political economy. To the bourgeois, in order that they may convince themselves how greatly the uneducated workers, who can be easily made to grasp the most difficult economic analyses, excel our supercilious, cultured folk, for whom such ticklish problems remain insoluble their whole life long. Classical political economy borrowed from the industrial practice the current notion of the manufacturer that he buys and pays for the labour of his employees. Footnote. Quote, by classical political economy I understand that economy which, since the time of W. Petty, has investigated the real relations of production in bourgeois society, in contradistinction to vulgar economy, which deals with appearances only, ruminates without ceasing on the materials long since provided by scientific economy, and there seeks plausible explanations of the most obtrusive phenomena for bourgeois daily use, but for the rest confines itself to systematizing in a pedantic way, and proclaiming for everlasting truths trite ideas held by the self-complacent bourgeoisie with regard to their own world. to them the best of all possible worlds. End footnote. This conception had been quite serviceable for the business purposes of the manufacturer, his bookkeeping and price calculation, but naively carried over into political economy, it there produced truly wonderful errors and confusions. Political economy finds it an established fact that the prices of all commodities, among them the price of the commodity which it calls labour, continually change, that they rise and fall in consequence of the most diverse circumstances, which often have no connection whatsoever with the production of the commodities themselves, so that prices appear to be determined as a rule by pure chance. As soon, therefore, as political economy stepped forth as a science, it was one of its first tasks to search for the law that hid itself behind this chance, which apparently determined the prices of commodities and which in reality controlled this very chance. Among the prices of commodities, fluctuating and oscillating, now upward, now downward, the fixed central point was searched for around which these fluctuations and oscillations were taking place. In short, starting from the price of commodities, political economy sought for the value of commodities as the regulating law, by means of which all price fluctuations could be explained, and to which they could all be reduced in the last resort. And so, classical political economy found that the value of a commodity was determined by the labour incorporated in it and requisite to its production. With this explanation it was satisfied, and we too may, for the present, stop at this point. But to avoid misconceptions, I will remind the reader that today this explanation has become wholly inadequate. Marx was the first to investigate thoroughly into the value-forming quality of labour, and to discover that not all labour which is apparently or even really necessary to the production of a commodity imparts under all circumstances to this commodity a magnitude of value corresponding to the quantity of labour used up. If, therefore, we say in short, with economists like Ricardo, that the value of a commodity is determined by the labour necessary to its production, we always imply the reservations and restrictions made by Marx. Thus much for our present purpose. Further information can be found in Marx's Critique of Political Economy, which appeared in 1859, and in the first volume of Capital. But as soon as the economists applied this determination of value by labour to the commodity labour, they fell from one contradiction into another. How is the value of labour determined? By the necessary labour embodied in it. But how much labour is embodied in the labour of a labourer of a day, a week, a month, a year? If labour is the measure of all values, we can express the value of labour only in labour. But we know absolutely nothing about the value of an hour's labour, if all that we know about it is that it is equal to 1 hour's labour. So, thereby we have not advanced one hair's breadth nearer our goal. We are constantly turning about in a circle. Classical economics, therefore, essayed another turn. It said, the value of a commodity is equal to its cost of production. But what is the cost of production of labour? In order to answer this question, the economists are forced to strain logic just a little. Instead of investigating the cost of production of labour itself, which unfortunately cannot be ascertained, they now investigate the cost of production of the labourer. And this latter can be ascertained. It changes according to time and circumstances, but for a given condition of society in a given locality and in a given branch of production, it too is given, at least within quite narrow limits. We live today under the regime of capitalist production, under which a large and steadily growing class of the population can live only on the condition that it works for the owners of the means of production, tools, machines, raw materials and means of subsistence, in return for wages. On the basis of this mode of production, the labourer's cost of production consists of the sum of the means of subsistence, or their price in money, which on the average are requisite to enable him to work, to maintain in him this capacity for work, and to replace him at his departure, by reason of age, sickness, or death, with another labourer, that is to say, to propagate the working class in required numbers. Let us assume that the money price of these means of subsistence averages 3 shillings a day. Our labourer gets, therefore, a daily wage of 3 shillings from his employer. For this, the capitalist lets him work, say, 12 hours a day. Our capitalist, moreover, calculates somewhat in the following fashion. Let us assume that our labourer, a machinist, has to make a part of a machine, which he finishes in 1 day. The raw material, iron and brass in the necessary prepared form, costs 20 shillings. The consumption of coal by the steam engine, the wear and tear of this engine itself, of the turning lathe and of other tools with which our labourer works, represent for 1 day and 1 labourer a value of 1 shilling. The wages for 1 day are, according to our assumption, 3 shillings. This makes a total of 24 shillings for our piece of a machine. But the capitalist calculates that, on average, he will receive for it a price of 27 shillings from his customers, or 3 shillings over and above his outlay. Whence do they 3 shillings pocketed by the capitalist come? According to the assertion of classical political economy, commodities are, in the long run, sold at their values, that is, they are sold at prices which correspond to the necessary quantities of labour contained in them. The average price of our part of a machine, 27 shillings, would therefore equal its value, i.e. equal the amount of labour embodied in it. But, of these 27 shillings, 21 shillings were values already existing before the machinist began to work. 20 shillings were contained in the raw material, 1 shilling in the fuel consumed during the work, and in the machines and tools used in the process, and reduced in their efficiency to the value of this amount. There remain 6 shillings which have been added to the value of the raw material. But, according to the supposition of our economists themselves, these 6 shillings can arise only from the labour added to the raw material by the labourer. His 12 hours' labour created, according to this, a new value of 6 shillings. Therefore, the value of his 12 hours' labour would be equivalent to 6 shillings. So we have at last discovered what the value of labour is. Hold on there, cries our machinist. 6 shillings? But I have received only 3 shillings. My capitalist swears high and day that the value of my 12 hours' labour is no more than 3 shillings, and if I were to demand 6, he'd laugh at me. What kind of story is that? If before this we got with our value of labour into a vicious circle, we now surely have driven straight into an insoluble contradiction. We searched for the value of labour, and we found more than we can use. For the labourer, the value of the 12 hours' labour is 3 shillings. For the capitalist, it is 6 shillings, of which he pays the working man 3 shillings as wages, and pockets the remaining 3 shillings himself. According to this, labour has not 1 but 2 values, and moreover 2 very different values. As soon as we reduce the values, now expressed in money, to labour time, the contradiction becomes even more absurd. By the 12 hours' labour, a new value of 6 shillings is created. Therefore, in 6 hours, the new value created equals 3 shillings, the amount which the labourer receives for 12 hours' labour. For 12 hours' labour, the working man receives as an equivalent the product of 6 hours' labour. We are thus forced to one of 2 conclusions. Either labour has 2 values, one of which is twice as large as the other, or 12 equals 6. In both cases we get pure absurdities. Turn and twist as we may, we will not get out of this contradiction as long as we speak of the buying and selling of labour and of the value of labour. And just so it happened to the political economists. The last offshoot of classical political economy, the Ricardian school, was largely wrecked on the insolubility of this contradiction. Classical political economy had run itself into a blind alley. The man who discovered the way out of this blind alley was Karl Marx. What the economists had considered as the cost of production of labour was really the cost of production not of labour but of the living labourer himself. And what the labourer sold to the capitalist was not his labour. So soon as his labour really begins, says Marx, it ceases to belong to him, and therefore can no longer be sold by him. At the most, he could sell his future labour, i.e. assume the obligation of executing a certain piece of work in a certain time. But in this way he does not sell labour, which would first have to be performed, but for a stipulated payment he places his labour power at the disposal of the capitalist for a certain time, in case of time wages, or for the performance of a certain task, in case of piece wages. He hires out or sells his labour power, but this labour power has grown up with his person and is inseparable from it. Its cost of production, therefore, coincides with his own cost of production. What the economist called the cost of production of labour is really the cost of production of the labourer, and therewith of his labour power. And thus we can also go back from the cost of production of labour power to the value of labour power, and determine the quantity of social labour that is required for the production of a labour power of a given quantity, as Marx has done in the chapter on the buying and selling of labour power, Capital Volume 1. Now, what takes place after the worker has sold his labour power, i.e. after he has placed his labour power at the disposal of the capitalist for stipulated wages, whether time wages or piece wages? The capitalist takes the labourer into his workshop or factory, where all the articles required for the work can be found, raw materials, auxiliary materials, coal, dyestuffs, etc., tools and machines. Here the worker begins to work. His daily wages are, as above, 3 shillings, and it makes no difference whether he earns them as day wages or piece wages. We again assume that in 12 hours the worker adds by his labour a new value of 6 shillings to the value of the raw materials consumed, which new value the capitalist realises by the sale of the finished piece of work. Out of this new value he pays the worker his 3 shillings, and the remaining 3 shillings he keeps for himself. If now the labourer creates in 12 hours a value of 6 shillings, in 6 hours he creates a value of 3 shillings. Consequently, after working 6 hours for the capitalist, the labourer has returned to him the equivalent of the 3 shillings received as wages. After 6 hours' work, both are quits, neither one owing a penny to the other. "Hold on there," now cries out the capitalist. "I have hired the labourer for a whole day, for 12 hours. But 6 hours are only half a day. So work along lively there until the other 6 hours are at an end. Only then will we be even." And in fact the labourer has to submit to the conditions of the contract upon which he entered of "his own free will," and according to which he bound himself to work 12 whole hours for a product of labour which cost only 6 hours' labour. Similarly with piece wages. Let us suppose that in 12 hours our worker makes 12 commodities. Each of these costs a shilling in raw materials and wear and tear, and is sold for 2.5 shillings. On our former assumption, the capitalist gives the labourer a quarter of a shilling for each piece, which makes a total of 3 shillings for 12 pieces. To earn this, the worker requires 12 hours. The capitalist receives 30 shillings for the 12 pieces. Deducting 24 shillings for raw materials and wear and tear, there remains 6 shillings, of which he pays 3 shillings in wages and pockets the remaining 3, just as before. Here also the worker labours 6 hours for himself, i.e. to replace his wages, half an hour in each of the 12 hours, and 6 hours for the capitalist. The rock upon which the best economists were stranded, as long as they started out from the value of labour, vanishes as soon as we make our starting point the value of labour power. Labour power is, in our present-day capitalist society, a commodity like every other commodity, but yet a very peculiar commodity. It has, namely, the peculiarity of being a value-creating force, the source of value, and, moreover, when properly treated, the source of more value than it possesses itself. In the present state of production, human labour power not only produces in a day a greater value than it itself possesses and costs, but with each new scientific discovery, with each new technical invention, there also rises the surplus of its daily production over its daily cost, while as a consequence there diminishes that part of the working day in which the labourer produces the equivalent of his day's wages, and, on the other hand, lengthens that part of the working day in which he must present labour gratis to the capitalist. And this is the economic constitution of our entire modern society. The working class alone produces all values, for value is only another expression for labour, that expression, namely, by which is designated, in our capitalist society of today, the amount of socially necessary labour embodied in a particular commodity. But these values produced by the workers do not belong to the workers. They belong to the owners of the raw materials, machines, tools, and money, which enable them to buy the labour power of the working class. Hence the working class gets back only a part of the entire mass of products produced by it, and as we have just seen, the other portion which the capitalist class retains, and which it has to share at most only with the landlord class, is increasing with every new discovery and invention, while the share which falls to the working class per capita rises but little and very slowly, or not at all, and under certain conditions it may even fall. But these discoveries and inventions which supplant one another with ever increasing speed, this productiveness of human labour which increases from day to day to unheard of proportions, at last gives rise to a conflict, in which present capitalistic economy must go to ruin. On the one hand, immeasurable wealth and a superfluity of products with which the buyer cannot cope; on the other hand, the great mass of society proletarianized, transformed into wage labourers, and thereby disabled from apportioning to themselves that superfluity of products. The splitting up of society into a small class immoderately rich and a large class of wage labourers devoid of all property brings it about that this society smothers in its own superfluity, while the great majority of its members are scarcely or not at all protected from extreme want. This condition becomes every day more absurd and more unnecessary. It must be gotten rid of. It can be gotten rid of. A new social order is possible, in which the class differences of today will have disappeared, and in which, perhaps after a short transition period which, though somewhat deficient in other respects, will in any case be very useful morally, there will be the means of life, of the enjoyment of life, and of the development and activity of all bodily and mental faculties, through the systematic use and further development of the enormous productive powers of society, which exist with us even now, with equal obligation upon all to work. And that the workers are growing ever more determined to achieve this new social order will be proven on both sides of the ocean on this dawning May Day and on Sunday, May the 3rd. Friedrich Engels, London, April the 30th, 1891. End of introduction.